How do gender, the public-private distinction, Mary Wollstonecraft, and the aesthetics of the 1950s resonate? What are we speaking of when we say gender? Is the social category of women politically useful? And finally, can contemporary feminism overcome critiques from the inside and bridge political differences? These elements and questions compose today's episode, Feminism. This is Political Compositions, the podcast where we explore the last 250 years of political, social, and cultural philosophy. We will confront thinkers, movements, and ideas from past and present that compose political philosophy today. I'm Jamie.
I'm Gijs.
So turn on, tune in, but don't drop out.
So, Jamie, what can we expect from today's episode?
A lot. Feminism obviously has a rich social and political history. Of course, this is because women, men, and their relations have always been part of any society in history. Women are the outsiders within. Let's just say that men could never do without women, so society always had a place for women, but not in particularly powerful positions. Anyways, to structure today's episode, I think we should approach it a little bit more thematically than, say, historically. Although, having said that, I would like to start with a short comment on feminism as an ideology, which lands me in the late 18th century with Mary Wollstonecraft and her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women.
It's not so easy to do without history, is it?
Right. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you might say. So Wollstonecraft is among the very first to address women's social position as a political project, even though she was basically only rediscovered in the last couple of decades, strangely. But her work is a nice entry point for us because she is not only vehemently against the British conservative politician Edmund Burke, but also against one of our frequent house guests.
Well, I'm not an expert on Wollstonecraft, but no doubt she went up against many men who believed they knew the rightful place of women. But most likely she must also have taken on that pesky Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yes, indeed. There he is again. He keeps showing up. Either way, in Rousseau's text on education, Émile, he, as we discussed, introduces the character of Sophie as a companion to and ideal partner for Émile. According to Rousseau, women have different aims and means, different virtues to strive for, in a complementary relation with men. Women are differently perfect than men, basically.
Right, as we said, Émile and Sophie are equal, but Émile is more equal than Sophie.
And Wollstonecraft disagrees with that. She is more of an Enlightenment thinker and argues instead that women should have access to or be educated in precisely the same ways as men. Rationality in this way is not different for men and women. And let me quote her here. "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone."
Whoa, that does flatter the graces of Mary Wollstonecraft. But she wasn't just an Enlightenment thinker, right?
No, there's another point she makes, which I find especially great and significant for us. She critiques Rousseau's use of the concept of imagination.
Imagination, the main theme of our Romanticism episode. I'm curious, as I admit I'm particularly attached to the romantic imagination, despite modern philosophy's aversion to it, like, for instance, in speculative materialism, or maybe exactly because of this aversion.
Well, I don't begrudge you for your romanticism, but Wollstonecraft here exploits a great paradox. First of all, maybe inadvertently, Rousseau makes women the pinnacle of humanity. In Émile, he argues that women's desires are caused by the imagination and therefore limitless. However, he uses that to argue for strategies to regulate this limitless desire, arguing for shame and chastity.
Well, he wasn't the only one to do that. Think only of Jane Austen and her frequent reference to virtues like constancy.
Right, but Wollstonecraft reverses this argument wonderfully. She rejects the call for the regulation of women's desires, although she does agree with Rousseau that women's desires are caused by the imagination. But for her, this makes these desires more human and thus more valuable and more true.
Amazing. So women are better romantics and better humans.
Basically. And in this, Wollstonecraft is a kind of precursor to feminism, which as a movement arises only much later. Still, though, she is a great example of how inherently philosophical feminism is, how feminism puts forward and has to deal with so many important philosophical questions. The first theme I wanted to explore here concerns the distinctions and relations between personal and private and the public and the political.
This reminds me of one of my favorite feminist battle cries. The personal is political. This was a big thing in the 1970s.
Yes, but I feel it is often misinterpreted or maybe overused. It was actually the title of an article by American feminist Carol Hanisch, written in the late 1960s, although apparently the editors inserted this title rather than Hanisch herself.
Okay, so what was this article about?
It was a reply to another feminist and other activist movements who argued that consciousness raising was anti-revolutionary or simply therapeutic.
Ah, yes, classic dilemma, therapy or revolution. I remember this discussion from back in the 70s in leftist political science. Division between those who were seen as society-oriented and those who were sensitive to personal relations, although actually both could be informed by feminism.
But as Hanisch and many others noted, it was often seen as unpolitical to advocate for change in personal relations. Tough politics should not be confused with emotional personal issues. Women's personal experiences of oppression, unjustly understood as marital trouble, for instance, were not a personal affair, in the sense that you cannot blame that specific woman or even that specific man and thereby understand it as a individual issue. It was a political or societal issue.
Okay, great. But then what is the misinterpretation with the personal is political? Seems quite apt to me.
I guess this insight doesn't mean that every single personal relation has political significance or that there is no difference whatsoever between personal and political. You can also be mistaken that political history moves through you.
Ah, but that was never the intention behind the slogan. Funny you should bring this up, because I think that rather reflects preoccupations from nowadays, like identity politics. And this was not the case back in those days. Feminists were much more concerned with trying to distance themselves from orthodox Marxist leftism, so with rejecting the idea that only labor issues count as political. So it's not that every personal thing is political. The more philosophical idea behind this slogan was that the boundary between what is personal and what is political is itself political.
And that's a really crucial issue, because it is about the transformative power of feminism. It doesn't just ask attention for the position of women, although of course that is an important part, but it also affects the way politics should be understood and its relation to social and personal affairs.
Yes, and that is why feminism didn't always fit in smoothly with other progressive movements. It's not just a matter of adding up or including in, as we would say now. Actually, I think it's always been one of the strengths of feminism that it doesn't fit in so easily. It always somehow keeps brushing against the grain.
A sign of the times, perhaps, of the 1960s, in which the so-called second feminist wave came up. There was a lot of brushing against the grain back then, wasn't there?
There was. The late 1960s were very much about politicizing, rebelling against traditional authority, coloring outside the lines, as they say.
Makes sense, although I'm not old enough to remember it, So what was it like?
Well, I'm not that old, right? In the 60s, I was in primary school, so Woodstock was lost on me, unfortunately. But the late 1970s, yes, it was an exciting time with free-spirited, brash, ironic activism, sharp discussions and confrontations, but also a lot of fun. Somehow people could be radically angry and radically funny at the same time.
So one of those confrontations was with Marxism, and maybe a good example here is the International Wages for Housework campaign. At the Third National Women's Liberation Conference in the United Kingdom in 1972, Selma James and Maria Rosa de la Costa proposed the conference take up 6 new demands. One of them was wages for housework, which set off the supposed domestic labor debate. By the way, debate is such an overused term in academia. I hope this was an actual debate.
Well, again, a little bit too far back in the day for me. But I guess this was not just an academic debate, but also a debate within activist circles. As I touched upon earlier, feminists tried to make inroads with the dominant Marxist left, which was concerned with wage labor, by arguing that housework should also be recognized as labor.
And how did that go with the Marxists?
Not so well, of course. According to classical Marxism, housework does not produce surplus value, only wage labor does. So no use bothering with it.
Actually, Silvia Federici tried to sidestep this discussion in the mid-1970s with a small pamphlet called Wages Against Housework.
Wait, against? Why?
Well, it was in a reader called Wages for Housework, but Federici tried to radicalize the demand for wages by linking it up with a more universal political position. Wages for housework is not simply about women getting paid for their work. She extends Marxism's critique of society to the place women are assigned by capitalism, the place of housewife and mother. She wrote something along the lines of, in the same way as God created Eve to give pleasure to Adam, so did capital create the housewife to service the male worker.
Another variation on the theme of Sophie and Emile. But doesn't Federici's argument then suggest that women's exploitation or their relegation to some secondary status only started with capitalism?
I don't think that's what she wants to argue. Also, when you look at her later work, Caliban and the Witch, A History of the Body in Transition to Capitalism, which is read by many students and scholars lately. I think she wanted to emphasize how capitalism has made an already bad situation worse, or as she put it more viscerally in her pamphlet, capital has made and makes money out of our cooking, smiling, and fucking.
There's the spirit of the 70s for you.
Yes. While right now we see sort of the opposite. A resurgence of the belief that women naturally do the housework, with women who understand themselves as trad wives, traditional wives. They have some kind of weird nostalgia for the ethics and aesthetics of the 1950s, before all these revolutionary movements occurred, when women had no choice but to become a housewife.
Hi, my name is Esty Williams. I am here to tell my story about being a traditional wife.
A traditional wife that is getting quite the TikTok following.
She takes care of the home. She takes care of herself. Trad wife is short for traditional wife. There is a little bit of a pushback going on with woke feminism, and I think a lot of women are finding that it is a wholesome lifestyle to be at home and take care of their families, whether it's just their husband or they have children. I think a lot of women are really embracing that part of femininity. I think a lot of women are just trying to showcase maybe like the opposite of boss babe, if you know what I'm saying.
What would you do if you find yourself to be single again without relying on your husband's income?
Well, that's where my faith comes in, and it's always there. And I would really trust and pray to God that He would guide me through that hard time, and whatever that may lead to, I don't know, but I trust in God. Pull yourself together and to make sure that you look presentable.
Now, unfortunately for the trad wives, this is an impossible move. We can maybe pretend as if the 60s never happened, but it made us aware of how those seemingly natural dynamics were actually socially produced or political. We cannot go back to a time in which those roles felt or seemed natural.
Right, a kind of self-delusion, nostalgia for a time these women didn't live in, for a feeling they never had. And more importantly, they can make these choices precisely because they are emancipated women now.
So even if you nowadays try to consciously make a conservative choice or even a reactionary choice, it's still a choice, and an emancipated one. There's no such thing as choosing to follow a tradition.
And actually, for that reason, there are no traditions anyway, because every continuation of such so-called traditions is a conscious choice and thus not traditional. The same, by the way, for women who choose to wear an Islamic veil. If this is what you prefer, so be it. But it has nothing to do with tradition. And actually, it never had. To the contrary, it always was a modern invention. So in that sense, not unlike the trad wives.
The difference being that those choosing to wear a veil can still be extremely modern, independent, and critical.
That's right. It doesn't signify being a traditional woman, confining yourself to housework and all.
So in that sense, they might be said to ally with Federici. Being a woman doesn't mean your place in society or in the home is automatically assigned to you. Okay, so the feminist movements in the 1960s and 70s, especially the more philosophical and radical ones, had to contend with a Marxist ideology and partially started thinking about how the one-dimensional social-economic position of women was supported and enforced by political decisions about what was considered work.
Well, not just work, but indeed what were considered naturalized or stereotypical images of women, both in society and in personal relations. But they also used Marxist vocabulary to go beyond Marxist issues.
Oh, like what?
Well, think for instance of the idea of the reproduction of mothering, which is the title of a 1978 book by Nancy Kodorov, a sociologist who also trained as a psychoanalyst. This is about how women are expected to mother. Women were not only expected to do housework, but also to do the work of mothering, to curate the role of mother, so to speak. As Kodorov wrote in her book, women as mothers produce daughters with mothering capacities and the desire to mother.
Oh, and why is this an example of using Marxist vocabulary?
Because where Marxists talked about the reproduction of labor as being the reason why wages are paid, Kodorov applied this idea to the reproduction of the family, or in fact, society at large. Important here is that not only positions are reproduced, such as labor or mother, but also attitudes, which of course in the case of mothering is even more important than in the case of wage labor. The work of care cannot be done just instrumentally or strategically. There's something intrinsic in it which is not present in factory work.
Which is kind of odd, isn't it? Mothers not only reproduce motherhood with its associated gender roles and attitudes of care, but somehow also societal relations at large, including male domination and cutthroat competition.
Yes, in an earlier article, Kodorov had actually argued that, and here I quote her, male dominance is rooted in a defensive and aggressive psychology of male selfhood and masculinity that grows from the son's relationship to his mother. This is more widely known as the mother-son dynamics of misogyny.
So, to put it crudely, that the type of relation of, say, servitude begins with the son expecting all women to mother him like his mother did?
Yes, something like that.
Surely this isn't the revolutionary aspect of her, that is Nancy Chodorov's feminist psychoanalysis.
No. The revolutionary aspect was more that she managed to overcome the hostility which was traditionally felt by feminists towards psychoanalysis, which is considered to be incorrigibly male-based and sexist, not without reason, of course.
Indeed, the focus in traditional psychoanalysis is on the sons. I mean, think of the Oedipus complex, which is at the core of classical Freudian psychoanalysis. Oedipus wants to elude his fate, but exactly by attempting to do so brings it about, which tells you something about the tenacity of dominant social relations.
So Oedipus messes up, and so do all men, which is sort of a correct insight of psychoanalysis, and quite radical, isn't it? This is just us. We cannot escape our fate here.
Still, this remains sort of stereotypical. Men go out and act, although admittedly they mess up. Women stay home raising daughters and sons, but aren't really allowed to mess up, much less make a big fuss about it.
Yes, this is why Nancy Kodorov has never been hailed as a leading figure in feminism, and even been considered as an advocate for the status quo, although that's not really a fair assessment. But perhaps her training as a sociologist and a psychoanalyst worked against her here. These are traditionally disciplines that are better at understanding how things are than at revolutionizing things.
Better at diagnosis than at therapy.
Yes, and failing our Feuerbach 11 thesis assignment.
To change the world rather than just understanding it. It seems there is some kind of paradox in feminism. In order to discard stereotypes and undo injustice, the stereotypes must first be reconstructed and the injustice made visible. But precisely in the reconstruction and making visible, the problems may be reproduced.
Yes, this is the burden of educating the white man, or for us Hegelians, of the master-slave dialectic. Part of the slave's predicament is to teach the master, to make him understand the inequality of social relations. The same for feminists. They must not only liberate women, they must also make men understand what is wrong with traditional society.
Then again, one way out of this predicament is to completely refuse any generally accepted idea of what a woman is or should be. In other words, to de-essentialize what it means to be a woman. And the philosopher who most famously argued for this kind of understanding is Judith Butler.
Judith Butler. She argued this fascinating point ever since her first book, Gender Trouble, from 1990. This troublemaking is explained in the subtitle, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. So Judith Butler aims to deconstruct the identity category of woman.
Wait, this is actually my territory, because she does this by reflecting on political representation. Her point here is something along the lines of Foucault and Derrida. We wrongly tend to think of representation as a one-way street. I, as a real existing person, and I am who I am, if you know what I mean, will look for someone to represent me in politics. So I will look for someone who thinks or acts like me so that they can adequately represent me or my interests.
Which sounds more or less like what I do when I'm shopping around for someone to represent me.
Right. But this is all wrong. So, yeah. Or at least it's only half of the truth, or just one side of the matter. Because I am influenced by my representative, I will think differently because of how they present certain issues or argue for this or that. In a sense, representation works just as much the other way around. The representative creates me as the subject of that politics.
That sounds counterintuitive. Are you saying that I'm not voting for someone to represent me, but that this person somehow appoints me as his or her voter?
I mean, in a way, yes. You only become a voter when there is someone else presenting themselves as a person you can vote for. Like you become a consumer when there are products on offer for you.
Still, it sounds odd to say that representatives create the people they represent. Also, it doesn't sound very democratic.
Well, democracy is dependent upon representation. But anyway, let's put the point this way to make it a bit more intuitive and more palatable. Neither one comes first, representative or represented.
Okay, I'll chew on that for a bit, but I don't see yet how this is relevant for women not accepting any identity ascribed to them by men or by society.
Well, like this. For feminism, the question is not merely how women might become more fully represented in language or in politics. That would be a traditional view of representation. The task is, however, to understand how the category of women is first produced and then dominated, exploited, or restrained by the societal structures through which women's emancipation is sought in the first place.
Okay, so emancipation of women is useless or even counterproductive when the category of women itself is taken for granted.
Yes, Butler thinks feminism is better off deconstructing the category of woman, so that a true feminism can emerge, one that is not bound by the patriarchal structures of existing society. Representation makes sense for feminism only when the subject of woman is nowhere presumed. There is no singular, stable category of woman, but there are a range of different types of women, or womenhoods, and so on.
Oh, I'm starting to hear psychoanalytic echoes of Jacques Lacan and maybe Julia Kristeva. Woman does not exist.
An ambiguous message, if ever there was one.
True, but is this not the ultimate consequence of a position like that of Butler, and in a way a repetition of what Freud said in a different way? We'll never know what woman stands for.
So are you saying it's not even really a feminist view?
Well, it is, in the sense that Freud said that we men cannot understand women, that they are a riddle to us as men. While with Butler, it is women who put forward that woman cannot be understood. That's a big difference.
I guess we can illustrate this point with one of Butler's philosophical interventions in the debate on gender and sex. Butler is sometimes credited with distinguishing between gender and sex standing for the biological dimension and gender for the cultural expression. But this is wrong. She's actually famous and controversial for undermining this distinction.
Sure. First, by saying, if indeed gender is different from the sex body, then why should we hold on to two genders? There could be, and in fact there are, many.
Radical in and of itself. But Butler's second move is even more radical. She says that the sex body and gender aren't really that separate at all. The sex body influences gender, sure, but gender also influences the sex body. More radically, what if the social cultural construction of gender retroactively produces a supposed natural state of a sexed body.
Again, sounds counterintuitive, of course. Retroactively producing a natural state. But there are actually constructions like that which are not so counterintuitive. Think of the notion of a taboo, something or a practice that cannot be questioned or even touched upon because there is supposedly some force of nature in it that will wreak havoc if we mess with it. But we don't even need anthropology to see that it is us, human beings, who established the taboo, determining culturally that this particular forceful something is nature.
And post-structuralism brings us the same message. What appears to us as natural does not precede the social and political structures in which we participate. So does not precede culture, but rather is an effect thereof. Nature is in this way just as much a construct, only we can get there in a negative sense, by determining what is not culture and what is then left for it. Maybe everything else?
Of course, there are also many opponents, and not just men, but also feminists who think there is something essential in being a woman, something really different from being a man, and that this kind of postmodern discussion only detracts from the political project needed to give more space to women. And frankly, it would be a stretch to say that they all buy into this Rousseauian fallacy of Sophie being there to supplement Emile.
Or that they simply don't understand Lacan.
Nobody does. But yes, indeed. And even more problematically, I feel, if there is nothing essential or natural to separate women from men, why still fight for women? If this is such a fluid category and you cannot really say who fits in with it, why fight for it? Why feel solidarity?
Yeah, this is a tough philosophical and existential dilemma, isn't it? Once you see the relativity of some cause because there is no God or no essence or no true ideology or whatever, why still fight for it? Or why even give your life for it?
Friedrich Nietzsche tried to solve this problem by turning it around. Only those values that are established by yourself are worth fighting and dying for. They are relative, yet absolute for you.
So no fighting for other people, no solidarity for a cause.
No. Unless someone else just happens to have picked the same noble values that you did, which can happen among aristocrats. But common people and women, not so much.
There's another kind of solution to this problem, which sort of splits the difference. Thinkers who say that although there is no essence to women, for strategic reasons we can claim, on occasion, that there is.
Whoa, that's more like biting the bullet than splitting the difference.
Yeah, I guess. The idea is to strategically argue for a temporary category of women in order to find points to alter or break up the social structures that women suffered from. Because even if there isn't an essence to women, we must act to counter the real existing suffering of women, whomever they may be.
Okay, a good cause, but it sounds to me like a would-be Nietzschean saying, okay, I don't really have those values that I should defend no matter what, so let me just fake them. Maybe that'll help.
Well, I guess the famous post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak did advocate for this idea of strategic essentialism. She called it a strategic use of positivist essentialism in a scrupulously visible political interests. So, in plain English, downplaying difference for political gain.
Still, to me, it sounds like fake it till you make it.
It's a difficult discussion where we find prominent feminist authors on both sides of the fence. Nancy Fraser and Sheila Benhabib on one side, Judith Butler and Gayatri Spivak on the other, to name just a few.
The fence here dividing modern from postmodern positions, or maybe better, critical theory from post-structuralist theory.
Yet the fence is also what unites them, right? Compared to a tennis game. The fence is like the net separating them, but they're still playing the same game.
Or at least, the playing enables them to think so.
In a final segment of this episode, I want to zoom in on an undercurrent of feminist theory and practice that has recently gotten more mainstream attention as intersectional feminism.
So maybe good to say first of all, very generally, that intersectionality refers to the various ways in which all kinds of social and political divisions might overlap within specific individuals or groups. For instance, you are not merely black or a woman, but both. You are a black woman. And as such, you may experience a specific kind of treatment or, in fact, discrimination.
And the term originally comes from the legal sphere. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an American civil rights advocate and critical race theory scholar.
Critical race theory, contentious academic field, especially in the United States. It's based on the idea, or the fact if you like, that American institutions and society are characterized by systemic racism. There have been attempts to ban it from public schools as being not scientific theory, but ideological propaganda. In 2020, the then President Trump claimed that critical race theory, and by the way, also the 1619 Project,
the project outlining the structural role of slavery in American history,
and that both these projects promote divisive concepts, toxic propaganda, and, wait for it, child abuse.
Wow, that's Donald Trump for you. Not at all toxic or divisive himself.
Not at all.
But anyway, it seems quite advanced to me that high schools would actually teach such academic theory.
Mostly they don't. But of course, that doesn't stop Republicans from making such charges. They do this not because there are grounds for it, but because they can.
And this is the United States, where black people, for instance, are ridiculously overrepresented in American prisons, and where seemingly unpolitical events such as the coronavirus outbreak disproportionately hit black communities. And generally, racism is still tangibly present.
As everyone knows who has ever been to the United States. But anyway, all this was supposed to somehow explain something about intersectional feminism.
Right. I think it will help here to discuss Crenshaw's original point. As a law professor, she wrote an academic article in which she discussed court cases in which black women claimed to have been discriminated against by their employer. The court, however, said that legal rules or principles on discrimination do not apply to the class of black women. Although in such cases, for instance, one against General Motors, there were indeed no black women to be found in top positions.
Oh, the law is not always synonymous with justice, is it?
My God.
As I understood it, in these cases, the judges said the law says that you cannot be discriminated against if you're black or if you're a woman, but there's no relief for people who are both.
Which is the world turned on its head. The more likely you are to be discriminated against, the less remedy available to you.
I suppose the reasoning of the courts is if there is no discrimination against you as a woman, or at least when the law forbids this, and there is no discrimination against you as a black person, then there is no extra discrimination you can suffer from being a black woman.
Which is disingenuous. It's like a civil servant telling somebody, yes, I can see you standing right in front of me, but administratively speaking, you don't exist.
Yeah, well, there's the law for you. Here again, we can quote Jeremy Bentham. Jurisprudence is the art of being systematically ignorant of what everyone knows. But to be fair to Crenshaw, she decided to bite the bullet and say straightforwardly that the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism.
In other words, there is some extra discrimination you can suffer from.
Yes, and this extra resides in the structural relatedness between different forms of discrimination. One form of discrimination attracts other forms, if you like.
Now, intersectionality isn't just a legal theory, right? I mean, even for Crenshaw, these legal cases resonate with the experiences of black women in general. Also, for instance, in activist circles.
It's a legal label, but it's now also a cultural label and actually a legal tool. But the experience it refers to, of course, is not new, especially, of course, among political activists.
And one of the most famous examples, already from the 1960s and 70s, is Angela Davis. She was among the black women who experienced marginalization within the feminist movement, or at least were not as influential as white women. And as a Black Panther herself, she was one of the very few women to have influence within that movement.
Angela Davis is a kind of living legend. Black woman, radical, communist, activist, 60s icon, scholar. Everything you always wanted to be, but were afraid to become.
She also studied under Marcuse, a member of the Frankfurt School, and she even went to the actual Frankfurt School and did a PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin.
As I understood, that PhD never actually materialized. And neither did the one she started at the University of California back in the 70s. But this was because the FBI had confiscated all her research material.
And actually, she was fired there for being a communist.
Teaching while communist.
Technically, she was fired by the university board, but behind the scenes, Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, had been pushing the board to do so. Then again, she was jailed on charge of owning guns used in a political assault. In court, she was then acquitted after spending 16 months in pretrial detention. Eventually, she became an academic expert on racism in criminal law.
As I said, everything you always wanted to be. As white male European professors of philosophy, not living in those times, we don't share much with Angela Davis, I'm afraid.
But wait, actually, we do share being professors of philosophy.
Who did get a PhD, but never studied with Herbert Marcuse.
But rather than feeling sorry for ourselves or engage in heroin worshipping, let's return to our topic so that we can wrap it up properly.
Yes, the experience of black feminists. So we cannot claim to speak for them, but we can try and understand what their position was and is within feminism and how they contributed to it. Despite, but in a way because of their unprivileged and, if you like, intersectional status.
Perhaps we can say that people like Crenshaw, but also Davis and Spivak, radicalized the feminist project, daring it to take its own principles seriously and acknowledge that even within their own ranks, discrimination and marginalization took place.
Because feminism has evolved. Feminism has changed. There was a time when I shied away from any identification as a feminist. After all, that's what white women did, right?
Yeah.
But increasingly, large numbers of black women, women of color, began to engage with the field both through scholarship and through activism.
Which is not to bash the feminist movement. On the contrary, it has been strong and receptive enough to acknowledge that emancipatory challenges would also play out within its own ranks. Intersectionality was an issue with General Motors, but also, and in a way more importantly, within feminism itself, which somehow managed to contain this internal division and even make it productive.
And now for the rest of society to pull off the same.
Which is going to be even more difficult, because not the whole of society is either black or female.
Which is why perhaps diversity is the more promising common denominator.
Yes, we can all more easily share in diversity. But then again, the problem is that it's hard to expect people to fight with all they've got for diversity. It's just not that kind of thing.
So we're back at the problem of politics, which is perhaps appropriate, as this is a podcast about political compositions. And issues like intersectionality and diversity are exactly issues of political composition.
And we also hope to be back later on with even more political compositions.
So for all of us, turn on, tune in, but don't drop out. This podcast was made possible by the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Center for Learning and Innovation at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. A special mention goes out to Mirjam Fuselier and Sun Liu. Thank you, Sam Vitikainen, for the beautiful opening and closing theme. Daniel Nolet for his expert mastery. And thanks to Ludo de Bo for his insights and guidance in this project. Finally, we would like to thank our editor extraordinaire, Max Wassink. And as this is our final episode, hopefully see you next season.